我们都知道美元是全世界最重要的法定货币，美元的动向呢会引起全世界的经济波动。但是大家有没有从另外一个角度想过哈？那这其实跟我们生活之间是存在一个矛盾的，就是在美国以外的其他这些国家呢，大家生活中都用的是本国的货币在进行商业交易。这些地方既然我们没有看到美元的存在，那它是以什么样的方式在控制着全世界的市场呢？在美国以外，美联储对美元的影响到底有多大？那其他的经济大国，比如说中国哈，那为了在美元主导的这个世界里面让自己国家的货币占有一席之地呢，都做过什么样的尝试？那美元资产和美国政府的债务是怎么样影响其他国家？那其他国家又是怎么样反过来利用美元和美元债务的呢？这一期我们就把上面这些问题都一个一个分析一下哈。而且这一期呢，我又找来了助攻。
It is the reserve currency system. It's called US dollar. But we need to keep in mind that there aren't any US dollars in it.
肯定有朋友这时候该说了，这不那谁吗？对，今天的助攻呢就是 Jeff Snyder， 他最主要的研究方向呢就是欧洲美元。那常关注英文财经内容的朋友们哈，应该对他是非常熟悉了。他也经常被大家戏称叫做欧洲美元领域的耶稣。那刚才我一直提到的这个欧洲美元呢，其实就是美国以外的美元。但为什么它的专业名词就不叫海外的美元呢？
That would actually be a better term. A lot of people is confusing. They hear the term Eurodollar and they immediately think Euro. That's the only term that anybody's ever heard with Euro. But essentially the Eurodollar is, or at least what it was originally, were US dollars that were on deposit largely in Europe but outside the United States. Because it started in Europe and really the city of London, it acquired the name Eurodollar sometime in the 1950s, and nobody really knows for sure when that happened because it was all underground. It was banks that were trading in US dollars for a variety of reasons. The Eurodollar was this offshore US dollar system that began to subsume the roles of a reserve currency because it was useful in a lot of different places, especially in the early post-war period in Europe. It was also widely available as more and more dollars became created. It became more and more of the reserve currency. To the point that throughout the 1960s, it really replacing the Bretton Woods system. It is the reserve currency system. It's called US dollar, but we need to keep in mind that there aren't any US dollars in it. There's no physical pieces of paper that the US government has printed. There's no Federal Reserve notes. There's really not a whole lot of bank reserves either. It's a virtual currency, reserveless currency, ledger money system that has filled the roles of a reserve currency. So it's centered on banks and balance sheets. And really, global banks that participate in it, they are the dollars that circulate throughout the world. Because it's a reserve currency, there's basically nowhere around the world that the Eurodollar doesn't impact. The reason why we had such a wave of global prosperity in the second half of the 20th century was the Eurodollar allowed a whole lot of innovation and technology to be adopted and funded in wide-scale fashion all throughout the world. So when the Eurodollar was functioning, things were really well. The world actually prospered quite a bit from it. Starting in August of 2007, and it hasn't been the same since. And so the world is actually going in the opposite direction. We've got deglobalization, drags on economic growth, and everything else. But the Eurodollar is, for all intents and purposes, you got to think about it as the reserve currency system.
但是在美元被全球各国广泛使用的这大几十年里哈，那我们对美元影响的印象呢，就是
The US dollar is also kind of kidnapping the whole world economy because it's the reserve currency and the only country that's controlling the reserve currency is the United States.
Yeah, that's a misconception too, because even though it's termed US dollar, the U.S. government has no control over it. The only way the U.S. government can control economic and monetary considerations around the world is essentially through sanctions. When they tried to cut off Russia, for example, from SWIFT, they had to beg banks not to allow the Russians to transact on SWIFT. And SWIFT is nothing more than a messaging system that's owned by a consortium of global banks. Again, it's a huge misconception that the U.S. dollar is controlled by the U.S. government or the Federal Reserve. That's what the U.S. government wants you to believe, that they have that authority and power. But the Eurodollar system, believe it or not, Joy, going all the way back to the beginning, one of the reasons why it started out in the first place, the Russians, the Soviet Union back then, didn't want to leave their US dollar balances on deposit with banks in the United States, fearing that the Eisenhower and then the Kennedy-Johnson administration would confiscate their dollars back then. So they left these dollar deposits, the initial Eurodollar, with banks in Montreal and Zurich and London, it was a big one, essentially so they could transact in US dollar terms, but outside the United States, outside the control, outside the reach of the US government. And because this has happened for so long and nobody really understood or knew what was going on, there's this big misconception that the US dollar is a national currency that is operated by the US government with the Federal Reserve as its monetary agency. And that's just not the case.
也就是说，我们在思考美元是不是绑架了世界的时候呢，里面其实还有一个细节，就是美元是怎么样传递的。那关于 SWIFT， 我在讲人民币那一期里面我详细的提到过它的原理和里面不同货币使用量的一些数据，大家可以回去看那一期哈。
The euro dollar, which is why I use the term euro dollar, because it distinguishes what we're actually talking about here, is a bank-centered monetary system that is called dollar. It is denominated in dollars, but there are no dollars. So it is essentially bank money. So it's not the US government that's controlling the eurodollar system. It's not the US that is enforcing dollar dominance throughout the world. It's the fact that the eurodollar system is the most useful, widespread, widely available currency system. And because it's useful and widespread, that's why it continues to be used today. It's not the US government making it useful. It's the fact that it is useful on its own terms. It does what it needs to do, at least in a minimum capacity, for a reserve currency system. So again, the US government wants you to believe that it is controlling the dollar, but the example with Russia shows that they're having enormous problems with that because the eurodollar is out there. And the eurodollar is what actually matters, not what the US government says.
那按照刚才 Jeff 说的这个各国银行记账系统联动，其实就促成了这样的美元交易的网络。那在美元在各个银行之间流动，而且被记录下来的时候呢，除非美国政府用硬性的政治手段拒绝某个地区使用美元，不然的话，其实很难对欧洲美元系统进行一个全方位的控制。说到这儿，大家有没有觉得，如果我们把这个每个银行的账本当做一个单位的话呢，而且各个银行之间又互相对美元有记账行为，这系统怎么越看越像区块链呢？不过我就这么一说哈，区块链不是这期重点。我不是公开了一些比较有限的跟观众1对1视频的这个预约时段嘛？那其中呢，跟我预约过的一位观众表达了这样一个看待事情的角度哈，我个人非常的赞同。那我也特别想跟大家分享一下，就是说我们经常会简单的把一个体系或者是机构当做一个庞大的有主观意识的个体，但实际上呢，每个系统里面都会有很多内部的博弈，而且越大的系统越是这样。那这就导致了一个系统在几十年内的这个发展其实也是有很大巧合性的。那我之所以赞同这种思路呢，是因为这个思路经常被媒体有意无意的给掩盖了，因为大家都想搞个大新闻嘛，把一个系统简化成一个个体的形象呢，就很容易让敌人或者朋友的角色变得非常具象化，那很容易引起大众情绪上的共鸣，而且反过来看的话呢，也是让大众的观点走向极端化的一个催化剂。那所以我觉得我们应该经常在吸收信息的时候呢，有意识的提醒自己，任何一个系统都是复杂多样的，不具有绝对的一个单一意识，那这样我们看事情呢就会比较客观，不那么容易去陷进这个阴谋论里面。那这一期的文字版本呢，也在我描述栏里面哈。大家如果对哪些观点或者说名词有一些疑问的话呢，可以拿我这文字稿当做一个学习材料。加入我邮件列表的话呢，我有了一些新的想法，或者是频道有一些新的动向呢，都会优先通知邮件列表里面的朋友们哈。那我们说回美元这问题上哈，那我跟 Jeff 的这个对话里面呢 ，Jeff 说了一个很有意思的事情，就是这储备金。大家都知道，现在全球最重要的储备金呢就是美元，但是大多数人呢很少去细想储备金到底为什么会存在，那它的深层意义和作用到底是什么？
I think what happens is most people don't really understand what a reserve currency is, and you don't really give it a second thought because why would you? It's not something that impacts, or at least you don't think it impacts your daily existence. A lot of people have this idea that reserve currency means you get to price commodities in your local currency, like oil, for example. Well, that's a byproduct of a reserve currency. What a reserve currency is it's a medium. It's an intermediary. So you can have systems on the opposite side of the planet that have their own currency systems, their own monetary arrangements, and basically their own separate economies. How do you get them to transact? How do you get them to trade in a seamless and efficient fashion? How do you get investment flows to go from one place around the world to the other? What the eurodollar did was because it was a middle currency, or what they used to call a vehicle currency, you could start with, say, Swiss francs. A bank in Switzerland had a deposit of francs from a wealthy customer that wanted to invest in the growing Asian economy, say Thailand, for example. In any other type of arrangement where there wasn't a reserve currency, that would be very difficult because you would be offering francs to Thailand when Thailand has no use for Swiss francs. And the only way to convert one into the other was to have a currency that stood in between them that was both available and usable in where it started and where it ended. So if the Swiss bank could instead convert their francs into US dollars, and then take those US dollars and invest in Thailand. Well, the US dollars were available in Switzerland, and the US dollars are useful in Thailand. Therefore, that allows money to transact through the US dollar intermedium all around the rest of the world. So suddenly, somebody who had cash in Switzerland could then invest in Thailand with basically no friction in between. And the only way that works is if, again, the US dollar is available and useful in a number of places around the world, as it became in its Eurodollar format. So because it became useful and available in so many places around the world, that's why it sticks around. It's not political. It's not anything other than the fact that it solves an enormous problem, which is you have a globalizing economy and no international currency. The Eurodollar actually became that international currency that allows all of these different systems all over the world to seamlessly integrate with one another, or near seamlessly. It's not perfect. Nothing's ever perfect. It's become increasingly difficult since 2007, but still there's no other competing currency system even on the horizon that can do what it can do, which is, again, get money to flow and credit to flow from one point on the earth to a complete opposite points, connecting places that you wouldn't necessarily believe could be connected that easily. That's why the Eurodollar is useful.
也就是说，我们其实可以从交易媒介这个角色去观察储备金，那这其实和我们人类经济活动发展的这个过程就连上了。就像几千年前人类使用贝壳当做交易媒介，或者说呢，再近一点，德国上世纪经历恶性通胀的时候呢，就是用货币去糊窗户，用香烟当做交易媒介。我们说回美国对欧洲美元的影响那我相信看影片的朋友们呢，也包括我自己，在这时候都会提出一个疑问，就是美联储加息降息对于美元的价格和经济活动很明显是有影响的呀。那如果说美国对于欧洲美元系统的控制并不是那么强的话，那我们要怎么样去看待美联储的利率的变化对于海外经济造成的波动呢？
They have tried to create this image of an all-powerful technocratic institution when, again, nobody stops and thinks what the Fed actually does. Everybody just thinks the Fed takes care of the dollar because the Fed has the printing press, when in fact this Eurodollar system doesn't require US dollars whatsoever. And so the Fed has very, very limited influence on the Eurodollar system. It's not zero, but it isn't as much as people imagine. In fact, it's very limited. The monetary system began to change with this Eurodollar arising in the 50s and really into the 1960s, which meant a whole bunch of things. Because it's a reserveless system and because it's controlled by banks basically transacting with one another, it was a blank canvas that allowed banks to transact in all different types of monetary forms that had never been available before. Things like derivatives. People don't know what a derivative is or what it's used for, but in many ways, a derivative is a different form of money. And so the 1960s and 70s, what the Federal Reserve found out was they don't even know how to define money that was being used in the real economy in very real ways. So throughout the 1970s, as the Fed was struggling to figure out what the hell's going on with the monetary system, and plus this was taking place offshore. This is the Eurodollar component. Outside the United States, in US dollar denomination, on the balance sheets of commercial banks all around the world, the Fed basically lost touch with the monetary system. And so when Paul Volcker came in, he didn't conquer the great inflation. What he basically did is admit that we don't know how to monitor, let alone regulate, the US dollars that are running through the global system. So instead, we're going to try to influence the behavior of banks and economic agents by raising and lowering a single interest rate. They ended up targeting the federal funds rate. It's even more ridiculous when you stop and think about it, that they can control the entire monetary system by increasing or decreasing the federal funds rate when the federal funds rate isn't even that important of an interest rate.
这里我多说一句那美联储调整的这个 Federal Funds Rate， 也就是我们平时提到的这个美联储的基准利率，其实是在上世纪70年代，也就是上一次美国大通胀之后才开始使用 Federal Funds Rate。那在这之前，其实最重要的利率呢是 Discount Rate 贴现率。这个部分的历史呢，我在之前的影片里面也提到过。
But essentially, that's what the Federal Reserve has been doing since the early 1980s, really the late 1970s. They realize they don't control the monetary system. They can't even define money. We wouldn't even know where to begin. And so to at least pretend like they're having some kind of influence on the monetary system and the economy in the United States, they've been targeting the federal funds rate for many, many years, decades now, and calling that monetary policy when it's really interest rate policy. It's not monetary policy. All the while, hoping that when they raise the federal funds rate, for example, that somehow, some way leads to a reduction in credit, therefore slowing down the economy, when that's not how it actually works. But as long as you believe the federal funds is in control of everything, then nobody asks the real question. What is it the Federal Reserve actually does? And then when the system broke down in 2007 and 2008, I mean, first of all, the very fact that we had a crisis in 2007 and 2008 should already be ringing a bunch of alarm bells about the capabilities of the Federal Reserve. Because the Federal Reserve, if it was such an all-powerful institution, all-powerful monetary institution, there never would have been such a massive dollar shortage in 2007 and 2008 to begin with. But anyway, they responded to the 2008 crisis by quantitative easing, which everybody thought, well, this is money printing. They're creating reserves out of thin air. Here's a bunch of money printing. And so as the Fed did QE after QE after QE, everybody said, okay, this is going to lead to inflation because the Fed is printing money. And as we all know, when a government prints money, it leads to inflation, except it never led to inflation. 2020 is a different thing, but during the 2010s, constantly heard every QE was going to lead to out of control inflation, and it never happened. And nobody stopped and asked the question, why? Why didn't it happen? Is because the Fed and its bank reserves are not money. The Fed doesn't print money, and the Fed's influence on the monetary system itself is very limited.
影片播到这儿了哈，我相信有很多朋友会觉得这是非常有别于平时我们在媒体上面听到的一些观点和观察角度。那你要是有这样的感受的话，那我做内容的目的就达到了。为什么这么说呢？这儿我想跟大家分享我的一个观念哈。那我们所有人其实都非常容易陷入一种 confirmation bias 的状态里面。这个 confirmation bias 中文翻译过来呢，就是证实偏差或者确认偏误。那意思就是说，我们会更倾向于去寻找或者听从我们本来就认为是正确的观点。那社交媒体平台呢，更是利用了我们这个认知上的可以说是特点，或者说我更认为它是缺点吧，去不断的推送我们已经潜意识里面认同的东西。那这个的结果呢，就是会让我们不断的强化自己已经有的观点，然后去敌视、攻击或者抵触跟自己有不同观点的人。那这个时候，哪怕对方是真诚的在讨论问题，在我们的眼里面呢，它都会变成一种威胁。那在我们意识到了我们的这个 confirmation bias 以后呢，那我们在讨论一个问题的时候，其实要经常主动的允许自己本身的看法受到质疑和挑战。因为经常从3、4个角度上去观察一个问题的话呢，然后不断的对自己的看法进行打磨，这样我们才能构建出一个更完善的思维架构，避免陷入对他人看法的抵触情绪里面。因为这个很可能会让我们变得非常的偏颇和极端。那这也是为什么大家会看到我经常在评论区里面回复大家的留言，哪怕是质疑我的留言，因为只有这样才能产生一种思维上的互动。哪怕呢是一直在观看我影片但是从来不留言的观众们，那这些朋友在看到我留言区跟大家的互动以后呢，也会从更多的角度上去思考问题。那这样我和我整个观众这个群体作为一个整体才能够不断的提升。我当然也希望看我频道的观众们在工作生活或者做投资决策上面临一些实际或者心理障碍的时候呢，也可以用这种多角度的观察方式去看待眼前的问题。那作为这个频道的创作者哈，我虽然不能强迫大家去跟我有一样的价值观，但是呢，我也是尽可能的去践行我认为是对的事情。那频道订阅人数不断上升，当然呢也是对我的一种肯定。这个我也是要非常感谢已经订阅我频道的朋友们。当然还没有订阅我频道的朋友们呢，如果你认同我的理念，或者是说你身边有类似的朋友，也欢迎你订阅我的频道，把我的频道分享给更多的人。那我们说回这个货币系统哈，在我跟 Joseph 对话的那一期里面呢，我们提到的美联储进行这个隔夜回购协议，也就是他在美联储工作的时候所负责的领域哈。那美联储是通过隔夜回购协议或者逆回购协议去帮助其他国家或者是金融机构解决流动资金的问题。那这个
Fed has done a lot of is actually increasing a lot of the swap programs. So that has been helping other countries with some, liquidity shortage issue. Is that somewhat of a giving extra supplies when needed to the rest of the world?
That's the intent. I would argue that the actual execution of the swap programs is much worse. Listen, they had dollar swaps opened from December of 2007. So they started with the overseas dollar swaps with the major central banks in 2007, yet we had a global dollar crisis anyway. So how effective could those dollar swaps have been? And they made them basically unlimited in the summer of 2008, heading into the worst part of the crisis. So you had massive draws on these overseas dollar swaps in September 2008, October 2008, right on into November 2008. And we had a crisis anyway. We had the worst 6-month period in global economic circumstances since the Great Depression, primarily because dollars were so short and so unavailable, it created liquidity problems in markets all over the world. So again, how effective were these dollar swaps to begin with? Again, this is one of those things that you're supposed to just accept at face value and not really think too much about, because it goes along with the myth of the Fed being the central bank to the entire world. The Fed is the primary dollar provider to the rest of the world through all of its very, very sophisticated and its very effective dollar means. And it's not really the case at all. What about, say, for example, 2019 or 2018? When you had central banks around the world complaining about a dollar shortage in their local jurisdiction. The head of the Reserve Bank of India, Urjit Patel, he got on the pages of the Financial Times in June of 2018 and said, we have a dollar shortage around the world. The idea that the Fed's dollar swaps have provided some kind of liquidity backstop or even some minimal level of liquidity to the rest of the world just doesn't meet with the observations that we see all across the system. And again, it gets us back into the wider problem, which is this malfunctioning eurodollar. The Fed has really no idea how to fix it, assuming they even have any interest in fixing it.
也就是说，如果我们从最终的效果去反向思考隔夜回购协议的话呢，虽然说美联储的目的是想要通过隔夜借贷的方式去解决欧洲美元系统里面存在的问题，但是依然还是很难完全避免出现经济大幅度波动的情况。那有没有国家或者机构尝试过去动摇欧洲美元这系统呢？
And there's a possibility that certain national currencies could become, say, a regional reserve, which, historically speaking, monetary systems usually were regional rather than international, or fully, completely global and international. So it's possible that you could have various blocks transacting primarily in one national currency or another, but I don't think that's efficient enough. I think that we've already passed into a globalized system as it is, so we really need a globalized currency system, and there just isn't any national currency that's even close to being capable of doing something like that. Most people start with China's yuan, but not even the Chinese want to internationalize the yuan. I mean, they made a half-hearted attempt about a decade ago, creating the offshore market, or at least starting to create the offshore market and the offshore yuan, but they never really allowed it to flourish in the way that it possibly could have. I have my doubts. But at least they started that sort of experiment, and then they kind of gave up on it. They kind of pulled the plug and said, yeah, we're not really comfortable with that, which is why the Chinese authorities themselves have consistently argued for using SDRs from the IMF as an international substitute for the eurodollar. But that's even more unworkable than any other possible framework, because SDRs are just another bureaucratic creation.
这个 SDR 全称呢是 Special Drawing Rights， 是国际货币基金组织建立的一种国际货币。那这种国际货币的定价目前是由5个主要经济体的货币价格按照比例来确定的，分别是美元、欧元、日元、英镑和人民币。其中呢，美元占比最大，日元占比最小。这个 SDR 的价格呢，每个工作日都会更新，因为这些货币的国际汇率都在变化嘛。不过呢，这个 SDR 的构成比例是每5年才变一次的。那具体的呢，我在讲人民币那一期里面也讲过哈，那大家可以回顾一下。如果我们缩小一些视角，看一下日本在欧洲美元系统里面的角色的话呢，我们就可以看到
If you're a Japanese bank and you're short of US dollars, which by the way, Japanese banks are short trillions of US dollars on a daily basis. If you're a Japanese bank short of US dollars, what happens if the marketplace doesn't roll over your funding? Well, you have very little recourse outside of maybe the Bank of Japan has some spare dollars that they can give you, because the Bank of Japan or the Japanese government has been stockpiling reserve assets, which is another warning sign and red flag here. The Japanese have been stockpiling reserve assets in US dollar terms since the Asian financial crisis, which, by the way, was another dollar shortage. So the Japanese government might be able to provide you with some US dollars. Today they sell some treasuries, they create some liquid dollar assets, and then lend them to you so that you can replace the market rollover that you didn't get because the marketplace is becoming increasingly difficult. So what the Federal Reserve has done is with these overseas dollar swaps is essentially make the Bank of Japan an extension of its discount window. So if you're a Japanese bank that runs into funding problems because the eurodollar market is no longer supplying dollars that you need, you can go to the Bank of Japan. The Bank of Japan doesn't need to sell treasuries. They can simply apply on your behalf for a dollar loan, essentially, from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York through this US dollar swap with the central bank.
2020年3、4月份的时候呢，全球都出现了非常严重的美元短缺的现象。那紧接着就是美国政府通过财政政策向市场里面撒钱，大幅度增加了美国的债务。 而就当大家觉得这个美元肯定会贬值的时候呢，美元的价格反而非常坚挺的维持在了历史的最高位，而这背后少不了欧洲美元系统里面出现了大量的抵押品短缺的问题。
You have to understand, we're talking about international money on a massive scale. And the only way you can really scale up money, I mean, used to be back in the early days, you and I, Joy, we could transact in US dollar terms because I knew you. You had a reputation, I had a reputation. We knew each other, we were familiar with each other. So you and I could borrow and lend dollars back and forth to each other on an unsecured basis because we had this reputational and informational advantage. But as the Eurodollar system scaled up, now you're transacting with people on the complete opposite side of the world in bigger and bigger dollar amounts. How do you mediate the risk of being able to do that? One of the things you do is say, well, okay, I don't know you, Joy, from anything, but you need US dollars. I have US dollars. If you have, say, some financial assets on your balance sheet that you could pledge to me as collateral, then we don't need to know each other. I just need to know what the collateral is. And if the collateral is standardized and something that's widely available, such as US treasuries, then we can transact with one another in huge scale, because all I need to know is I've got a US treasury as collateral in my possession. I've lent to you US dollars. If you default on that dollar loan, I know I can sell the treasury tomorrow because I have the right to seize it and sell it. So collateral allowed the Eurodollar system to achieve scale and reach that was before then unimaginable. Think about during the 1990s, for example. The federal government actually almost ran a surplus, which meant that there was a shortfall of the treasuries available to be used as collateral. So if there's not enough treasuries available as collateral, we've got to find something else. Otherwise, you and I can't do business together because I don't really know you and I need some kind of security. So the monetary system, the Eurodollar system, all these banks, not only were they creating new forms of cash, they also created new forms of collateral. And this is one of the reasons why securitization took off. My argument for what happened in March of 2020 was really April 2020. The reason we got out of that crisis was because the federal government issued trillions in treasury bills at a time when the marketplace was really starved for that type of collateral.
It sounds like the US government needs to keep a deficit to keep the treasury out there running. Otherwise, people just have to use the mortgage bond, all kinds of riskier bond.
And that's the perverse aspect of it, because the more the federal government issues debt, the better the system functions.
Right.
So you're basically rewarding all the worst types of behavior from the government.
这个部分也解释了为什么在过去的20年里面，我们发现市场上面的金融衍生品变得特别的多。这些产品的出现也都跟欧洲美元系统里面美元抵押品短缺有着非常直接的关系。那之前的影片里面呢，我提到过哈，现在很多的放贷机构正在大量的回购自己卖出去的商业地产债务合同的金融衍生品，也就是 CRE、CLO。Commercial Real Estate Collateralized Loan Obligations。 那这部分商品其实不光在美国境内有很大的交易，在欧洲美元市场也成为了一种非常重要的金融衍生品，在市场里面流通。
What's the impact on the CRE, CLO to the rest of the world?
Well, there's a couple different things going on here. On the one side, you're right. There's some funky business going on with especially commercial real estate structures that we don't really have enough information on. But we keep getting reports that especially CLO sponsors they're trying to limit the losses that they're taking, that the losses that'll be taken on certain structures. They're increasingly nervous that the marketplace will just turn into a complete mess of chaos if they start booking some of these losses, which going all the way back to 2007, that's what kicked off the collateral shortage. Was essentially when subprime mortgage bonds became less and less liquid. As they become less and less liquid, they become less and less acceptable as collateral. Because again, if I'm lending you cash and I get security back from you, I don't care what the security is. I only care that I can sell it tomorrow and be reasonably assured I get my money back. And so if there's any doubt whatsoever, it doesn't matter if the bond that you're posting is the most money good, spectacular credit characteristic bond. If the market behind it becomes squirrely and unreliable, I'm not going to take your collateral because I don't know that I can sell it right away at the price I need to get. So as CLO markets potentially become less liquid, that means that these CLOs, and particularly commercial real estate structures, become less usable as collateral in a bunch of forms, not just in cash for collateral, but also as collateral for collateral, as I talked about before, where you're swapping riskier assets for US treasuries and then to borrow cash on the US treasury collateral. It gets really complicated because the Eurodollar system itself is like a Frankenstein's monster that was just flapped together over the many, many years. It's so incredibly complex and complicated, hardly anybody really understands how it works and how it fits together, including everybody that operates in it. So there's always that dynamic, that risk that information asymmetry could become something bigger than it really, I don't want to use the term needs to be, but that's what we're basically talking about. So as the commercial real estate bust progresses and we don't get a lot of information back from the system, we don't get a lot of price discovery, more and more people get a little bit concerned. They get a little bit itchier on the trigger finger. They might be much more likely to sell over basically nothing. And that makes the market more and more unreliable and illiquid. That makes the collateral less usable. And then you get into the whole collateral squeeze and everything else. But on the other side of that, we also have to keep in mind that CLOs in particular have gotten a huge bid over the last couple of years from a lot of different sources, but primarily from Japan. The Japanese have been squeezed by higher funding costs in US dollars. They have been buying riskier and riskier CLOs in particular in order to reach for yield to try to create some positive carry on a whole lot of their activities. So they've been depressing spreads, making it look like the CLO market is increasingly less risky. At the same time, it is likely becoming more risky, which leads to a whole bunch of really, really bad potential. If Japanese buyers, who've been the heaviest buyers of the CLO market, start to get the sense that maybe all the assumptions that went into them buying the CLOs in the first place, maybe they were wrong about them, they remove that bid, it accelerates the downside in CLOs and then creates much bigger liquidity problem than it otherwise would.
那我们来总结一下这一期哈。影片一开始呢，我就提到了欧洲美元其实指的是美国以外的美元，而美元变成全世界最重要的交易货币呢，除了美国从上世纪开始就一直是领先的经济大国以外，全球化的趋势呢，也让美元成为了全球最广泛存在也最具有价值衡量功能的这么一个媒介，而这也就是储备金这个概念的深层含义哈。那从现在我们这个时间点如果反推的话，整个欧洲美元系统形成过程中，苏联非常巧合的成为了一个推手。那现在我们看到美联储通过控制银行之间短期放贷的这个利率来控制美元价格的这个方式呢，其实也是从美国上世纪70年代这大通胀时期才开始的。虽然说美联储非常主动的在设立这些互换协议哈，帮助解决全球美元短期流动资金的问题，但是从结果来看，其实还是不能避免全球金融市场和实体经济的波动。虽然说欧洲美元系统里面几乎是不存在任何实体的美元的，但是从金融角度上来看，为了让已经达成全球化的这个世界经济能够继续运行下去，美国作为目前全球经济的发动机，它的国债就变成了最公认的、最有价值的也最稳定的抵押品。于是非常矛盾的一幕就发生了哈。虽然大家都觉得这个美国政府的高负债会让美元失去信用，但欧洲美元系统为了能够平稳的运行下去，反而呢是需要美国继续不断的提高自己的负债才能实现的。那不然的话呢，欧洲美元系统参与方就不得不退而求其次，寻求美元债务的金融衍生品作为抵押品进行借贷和放贷。那这个呢是有非常大的隐患在里面的哈。那最后面呢，我们说到的这个商业地产的债务的衍生品 CRE、CLO 就是一个很好的例子。我们在这儿可以看到一个很有意思的现象哈，就是说在美国的美元和在美国以外的这个美元是有两套有一些交集但又相互独立的这个运行系统。那虽然说我们看到的这个现象是美元的动向会影响世界，但与其说美国用美元控制世界，不如说这事儿呢其实是一个愿打一个愿挨。比如说中国哈，那中国其实也不是没有尝试用人民币去取代一部分美元，但目前这个世界对于接受人民币作为衡量价值的一个媒介，这个信心呢还是远远要低于美元的。我这也不是说美元或者说欧洲美元系统是一多么优秀的系统哈，它其实还是有很多问题，当然呢也不可能一直延续下去，但按照目前的情况来看，我们确实也不得不接受美元在世界贸易和金融领域上目前呢还是没有替代品的。那了解欧洲美元的原理和了解整个宏观经济这领域呢，其实并不仅仅是停留在理论层面上的东西哈。宏观经济是社会体系、人类行为、政治学、心理学还有更多学科的一个集合。那了解宏观经济其实能够帮助我们更好的去看清我们生活的这个世界它的运行模式是什么样的，那让我们更清楚的意识到我们在整个全球化的这个经济体系里面处在一个什么位置，世界的趋势是什么样的，那金钱又是怎么流动的。那这些呢都是可以帮助我们，比如说在像生活方式、事业选择和投资标的这些我们需要做出抉择的问题上呢，会有一个更加清晰的方向。毕竟我们要先了解游戏规则才能做到顺势而为嘛。